Hello everyone, welcome to another interesting and informative session of the Analyst brought to you by Vajiram and Ravi. In today's session, we will discuss 9 important articles as featured in the Hindu and Indian Express for your comprehensive understanding of the current affairs explained to you in the easiest language possible. The topics are as follows. In the first topic, as recently the National Board for Wildlife has given green clearance to several controversial projects in various protected areas, in the backdrop of this, we'll try to examine the shortcomings of the Wildlife Protection Act 2022. In the second topic, we will try to assess the claim which is made by the government about 100% electrification in the rural areas. Then in the third topic, we will try to understand what is digital public infrastructure and what are the rising concerns associated with it. Then in the fourth topic, we will learn the salient features of the National Research Foundation, and finally in the fifth topic, we will try to understand what is Financial Action Task Force. Towards the end, there will be news snippets which will help you to excel in the prelims examinations as well. So stay tuned. In its first meeting after the Lok Sabha polls, the National Board for Wildlife has actually cleared several controversial transmission line projects highlighting the issues which are associated with the Wildlife Protection Act of 2022. This act forms an important component of your GS3 paper under the larger theme of biodiversity and environment, and GS2 paper under the larger theme of government policies and interventions. So you guys might have heard about the salient law which our country has for the protection of wildlife, and that is Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, which was actually amended in the year of 2022. This act basically creates a legal framework for the protection of various fauna and flora, and also provides for the management of their habitats, such as, for example, wildlife sanctuaries, national parks, conservation areas, which are basically the protected areas which are created by the government. So, we will start our discussion from the various salient provisions of this amended act, which actually amended the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. And keep this in mind that all this information has been sourced from the original act itself. So, if possible, note it down. So, the chapter 4 of this act actually provides for the protected areas, such as, for example, wildlife sanctuaries, which will be created by the state government. And this state government will actually appoint a collector who is actually an Indian Forest Services official, who will determine the extent of the right of any person who is actually inhabiting these wildlife sanctuaries. These right of these persons will be recognized under which act? Under the Forest Rights Act of 2006, which says that, okay, if you or your ancestors has been living in this particular forest for at least 3 generations or 75 years of time, then your right of inhabitation in this particular area will be recognized. What if your right is not recognized and thus the government need to rehabilitate you? Then also there exists a provision of Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act of 2013. On similar lines, there is also a national park. Who will declare a particular area as a national park? Again, the state government. Keep this in mind that no alteration of boundary or area to such national park can take place unless and until it is approved by the National Board for Wildlife. And the chapter 2 actually provides for the important bodies for the protection of wildlife, one of them being the National Board for Wildlife. This NWBL, it came under which act? It came under the Wildlife Protection Act, which was again amended in the year of 2002 to create this National Board for Wildlife, which is actually chaired by our Honorable Prime Minister, and the Minister of Environment and Forest actually act as Vice Chairperson. The same board also contains 3 members from the parliaments. 2 of them actually comes from the Lok Sabha and 1 of them actually comes from Rajya Sabha. There are also representation from the non-governmental organizations which are working for the protection of this wildlife. And there are certain people who are appointed by the central government among the eminent conservationists, ecologists, environmentalists, etc. Keep this in mind that on the very same line, there also exists a state board for wildlife which is chaired by the chief minister of that particular state. When we have understood this, let's try to understand the provisions related to the hunting of this wild animal, which is provided under the chapter 3 of this act, which says that actually the killing of such wildlife is completely prohibited. Keep this in mind. If the animal is listed in the Schedule 1 and the Schedule 2 of this act, which we are going to discuss further in the discussion. However, the hunting is actually allowed in several exceptional cases, such as, for example, if the chief wildlife warden, which is appointed by the state government, comes to this conclusion that such animal has actually become dangerous to the human life or is disabled or deceased. Keep this in mind that the Act also recognizes the kind of judgment which was passed by the Madras High Court, that no such animal actually act as the property of the government, rather they are the wealth of the nation. On the basis of this small discussion which we just had, just try to solve this particular question which was quite difficult for the students at that time. Moving forward, there are 4 schedules in this particular act for the protection of flora and fauna. Keep this in mind that under the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, there was actually 6 schedules. These 6 schedules has now been reduced to the 4 schedules. The first of which actually deals with the protection of wildlife animals. The Schedule 1 actually provides the highest level of protection. And which are the animals which are included here? So they have been handpicked so that you don't get confused in the examination, such as, for example, black bug or chinkara, Asiatic black bear and brown bear, your Asiatic wild dog dhole, the grey wolf which has been very recently in the news, the bharal or the blue sheep, the whole family of the cats, such as, for example, lion, cheetah, clouded leopard, tiger, snow leopard, fishing cat, etc. Also, a family of deer which includes musk deer, hog deer, the Kashmiri hangul, the Barasingha, your elephant, and your black and blue corals as well. Then there comes the Schedule 2, which actually provides the lesser degree of protection to these animals. The animals in the list of Schedule 2 are nilgai, the flying fox. So keep this in mind that the whole family of deer has been kept in the high protection area, Schedule 1, such as, for example, musk deer, hog deer, Kashmiri hangul. But the spotted deer or cheetal is not included in this list. So cheetal has been kept in Schedule 2. Then there is Indian hedgehog. Also, don't form this idea in your mind that if any particular species is coming from the region of Andaman and Nicobar, then obviously that species will be in Schedule 1. So for that, we have included Andaman and Car Nicobar rat, which is in Schedule 2. Then any crow and allies, all kind of cuckoos, all kind of ducks, geese and swan, as well as your greater and lesser flamingos also forms the part of your Schedule 2 itself. Here, for our further discussion, keep this in mind that if these species are included in Schedule 1 and Schedule 2, they cannot be killed unless and until provided so by the chief wildlife warden, or obviously if you are killing them in the case of self-defense, right? Then there is Schedule 3. Schedule 3 actually provides for the protected plant species. So specifically for the flora, which are the species of flora included in this? Your Neelkurinji, Mishmi Tita, turmeric, blue vanda, red vanda, your pitcher plant, as well as your orchid and the kut, which you get in most of the rural areas. That has been included as well. Then comes your Schedule 4, which specifically deals with the specimens under the CITES, the Convention on International Trade on Endangered Species. So the species which forms the part of this CITES bracket, that has been included in the specific Schedule 4. The species such as, for example, your Vicugna or camels, the brother of Virat Kohli, that is Axis Kohli, which is a deer, the Canis lupus or a wolf, and your Ursus actos or a brown bear. Keep this in mind that these are the specific specimens which are included in the CITES list, and now under the amended act we have got a specific provision for these species. Now coming to this next part of the discussion, a question might be arising in your mind that okay, this amendment has been done, but what was the requirement? The requirement was that we actually wanted to bring our Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 in the conformity with the provisions of Convention of Endangered Trade, Convention of International Trade on Endangered Species. This CITES is basically a convention, an international framework which regulates the trade, the transboundary trade between one country to another among these endangered species. And this CITES framework was actually framed by IUCN in the year of 1975, and it came into the force in the year of 1975, and it was actually joined by India we became a party to the CITES Convention in the year of 1976. Keep this in mind that IUCN is not a United Nations body, rather it is just an observer, and it was created by various countries, civil society organizations to protect the wildlife in the year of 1948 itself. Now, this CITES is actually administered by the United Nations Environment Programme, and its headquarters is located in Geneva, Switzerland. The question is that, okay, we brought the WPA 1972 in conformity with the CITES, but what was the need? The need was that we were actually trying to import an endangered species which had become extinct in our country, that was cheetah, from the countries of Namibia and South Africa. So for that purpose, our domestic law had to become in conformity with the international law in trading of these endangered species, and that is CITES. The CITES, how it regulates the international trade in these endangered species? By creating several appendix, such as for example Appendix 1. The Appendix 1 actually includes the species which are threatened with extinction. So in this case, the international commercial trade is generally prohibited, not absolutely, because we can see that in the case of cheetah, how it has been imported from the region of South Africa to our country. Then there is Appendix 2. These are the species which are not necessarily threatened with extinction right now, but they can actually become that in the future if their trade is not regulated. And in this case, the international commercial trade is allowed, but there are a lot of restrictions which are imposed on this trade. The third is your Appendix 3, which basically deals with the species subject to the regulation within the jurisdiction of a party and for which the cooperation of two countries is actually required. So when we have understood about the appendix, the CITES and the reason for the amendment, just try to solve this particular prelims question and if possible comment or answer in the comment box, and we move forward to the next segment, the issue, and that is what are the challenges revolving around this Amendment Act of 2022. The first is that if we look at our country, there are more than 100 national parks, more than 560 wildlife sanctuaries. But despite all of these staggering numbers of protected areas, it only constitutes 5% of the total area of the country. When we are saying this, keep this in mind that thus there are a lot of endangered species such as for example tiger, elephant, blackbuck, gangetic dolphin. Most of them actually remain outside the protected area, such as for example 29% population of the tiger, 67% population of elephants and 100% population of gangetic dolphin. Another major issue is that in this Amendment Act, it has actually substituted the definition of tiger and endangered species to just the normal wildlife, which will obviously compromise the protection of such critical species in our country. The third is that it has actually removed the present schedule of the vermin species. So see, for example, earlier what used to happen that there was a Schedule 6. The Schedule 6 has got a complete list of vermin species. So these vermin species were basically declared by the central government at that time. The species which has become kind of invasive in particular areas, which are actually damaging the crops or something like that. And for that particular reason, they can be culled or killed by the authorities. Now it has removed such a schedule of the vermin species altogether. So for example, very recently the state of Kerala, it was actually demanding for the inclusion of wild boar in the list of vermin so that can be culled in the region of Kerala because it was actually damaging the crops of a lot of the farmers. So obviously now the state has to go where? To the central government to ask, then it will declare a particular species as a vermin. Then certain action can be taken by the state forest authorities. The next is another such federal issue that now only center can regulate the trade of invasive alien species such as for example Lantana camara. So now let's say that if trade happens of some flora and in that some Lantana camara seeds comes to the region of Tamil Nadu, now it becomes an invasive species there. So obviously the Tamil Nadu will hold home as responsible, obviously the central government. And such invasive plant species are actually threatening 66% of our natural area of our country. Another major issue is that let's say that if I am keeping a captive animal which is kept under the Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 of this Act, and I go to the state authority, the forest authority, and I say that okay, I want to surrender this animal, I had made a mistake. For that purpose, it does not provide any compensation on the voluntary surrender. So obviously there is no incentivization which I am getting for the good deed which I am doing actually. The next is that it does not address the issue of human-animal conflict altogether. So for example, if you guys are reading the newspaper, you guys might be frequently coming across the articles such as the death which has been caused due to tiger attack or the deaths which has been caused due to elephant attack. Just look at the staggering numbers of human-animal conflict which is increasing day by day. Very recently, there was a news about the wolf attack in the region of Bahraich in Uttar Pradesh. So this particular act, it has got no specific provision to deal with this human-animal conflict. Thus, the state forest authorities has got no specific guidelines which they can follow in the case of such human-animal conflict, such as for example, look at the administration of Bahraich. They are actually creating shelter homes to protect the villagers from the wolf packs. Now, let's say that if the state authority of the Uttar Pradesh wants to declare this particular animal of wolf as a vermin, what can it do it directly? Absolutely not. It will require the permission of the central government as we discuss. So that is obviously another issue. The next is that now the section 43, it actually allows for the use of elephant for religious and other purposes. So earlier the section 43 of the WPA 1972, it completely prohibited any kind of trophy animals. So you cannot keep trophy animals. In this case, the elephant was actually declared as a heritage animal in the year of 2010 on the recommendation of Mahesh Rangarajan Commission. The total number of captive elephants, if we look in the particular state of Kerala, they were 521, and various wildlife right activists actually raised this issue that how there has been several elephants which has died in captivity. But now this provision has actually been diluted. So now you do not need to apply to the transfer or transport of any live elephant which has got a certificate of ownership. So that is also another issue. Such major dilutions which are taking place. One is specifically with the dilution of the role of National Board for Wildlife, from where we started our discussion, because it is basically a body to protect the wildlife. What it is actually doing? It is actually clearing the controversial transmission lines in the Mollem National Park of Goa, which is within the Bhagwan Mahavir Sanctuary, as highlighted by the today's article. It has also passed transmission line in the Wild Ass Sanctuary in the run of Kutch, Gujarat. Or it has just made a kind of a criticism of the construction which was taking place in the Son Ghadial Sanctuary of Madhya Pradesh. So that what it is being now limited to. Obviously, it is giving primacy to development in these protected areas over the right of wildlife in that particular region. Obviously, that will lead to what? The declining population of critical endangered species, such as for example, Indian bustards, who are obviously colliding with these transmission lines, and their population is rapidly declining, coming to up to 150. Thus, what are the steps which can actually be taken? So obviously, the Act itself shall provide a specific legislation to give primacy to conservation over development. Specifically, if we take the example of the Great Nicobar Island project, which is actually under the consideration a lot, then obviously we can follow the directions which were led by the Gadgil Committee for the protection of these critical habitats in the region of Western Ghats. Then the identification of vermin power shall actually be transferred to the state government. The wildlife protection as a subject altogether shall be given to the state government in the 7th schedule list. So it was actually transferred by the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act of 1976, which transferred this subject to the concurrent list. The demand is that it shall again revert back to the state list. The next is that the state government shall actually create a management and scientific authority, and there shall exist a legal framework for human-animal conflict, that how we need to proceed in this particular direction to curb down these cases. So keep these suggestions in your mind. If possible, try to comment the answer for this particular question. Let's see if you guys can answer innovatively, and we move forward to the next news. The article highlights that how only large village has been benefited from the universal electrification, the idea which was envisaged by the government back in 2015, and it actually suggests for the adoption of microgrids in the rural areas, something which we are going to discuss. And this whole idea of rural electrification and the government steps which has been taken forms an important component of your GS2 paper under the theme of government policies and interventions. Let's first try to understand what do we mean by an electrified village. So as per the National Electricity Policy 2005, an electrified village is one which has got the basic infrastructure such as, for example, the transmission lines, or for example the transformers to actually supply the electricity to that village, and that electricity is provided to any inhabited locality as well as any Dalit hamlets. Also, if such electricity is being provided to the important functionaries in the village, such as for example the panchayat office, the health centers, the schools, etc. And remember, if the number of household electrified is at least 10% of the total number of houses in the village, then also that particular village is considered to be electrified as per the National Electricity Policy 2005. So now let's try to understand the status of rural electrification as by the data which has been provided to us by the government. So the government says that under the Gram Jyoti Yojana, the government has achieved 100% village electrification. It claims that as on April 2015, there were around 19,679 unelectrified villages in our country. However, by the date of 28th April 2018, 100% village electrification was achieved, and the last remaining unelectrified village which was actually electrified, that was the Manipur's Leisang village. How this electricity reached to all these particular people? So as per the Central Electricity Authority, at present around 99% of the total population has access to electricity. There are around number of 150 power plants which are providing this electricity to the rural areas specifically, and they have generation capacity of around 25 gigawatt with the per capita generation of around 560 kilowatt per hour. So what were the benefits of such rural electrification which was envisaged under the National Electricity Policy of 2005? The first is obviously to increase in the agricultural yield. So if you guys can actually recall from the last lecture how we were discussing that the 54% of the farmers in our country, so 46% are monsoon dependent, 54% actually irrigate their fields by using agricultural pumps to run which they require electricity. So obviously if the electricity will increase, the irrigated area will increase, and that will obviously increase the yield. At the same time, it will also facilitate the mechanization of agriculture, which we often talk about. So obviously, let's say if you want to run the machines in any industry, what is the most basic requirement? You need electricity. And if you are getting this electricity, obviously that will lead to the growth in micro, small and medium enterprises in the rural areas. So that will lead to what? That will actually lead to employment creation. And if employment in rural areas will increase, it will obviously solve the problem of disguised unemployment in the rural areas which prevails. Then obviously such electricity provision can lead to improvement in health, education as well as banking services, thus increasing the idea of financial inclusion, such as for example the completion of Jan Dhan Yojana, which has completed the 10 years to even use that, right, to do the mobile banking linkages, to do the normal payments through UPI, what you require, the basic requirement of electricity. Also, it will curb down the digital divide. So, for example, as per the NSSO data for 2023, only 24% of the rural villages are actually connected to the internet. So, obviously, you guys will ask, sir, that why they are not doing this basic thing? Why they are not availing internet in rural areas? There are multiple factors. One of the very small factor there is poverty, right? Because obviously social media does not feed the hunger. So they have much greater concerns to be worried about than having internet and social media. Also, there is increasing issue that if there is not electricity supply only regularly, what they will do with the Wi-Fi connection? Then obviously if all of this is being taken care of, the social security net in the rural areas, that will obviously enhance. Now, if we analyze that all these benefits which were envisaged under the National Electricity Policy of 2005, what has been the achievement of that, the results of that? So there has been a study which has been actually came in the today's newspaper, which has actually provided the analysis of Gramin Vidyut Yojana 2005. And this Yojana, it actually envisaged to provide rural electrification to around 4 lakh villages. So the study says that the access to electricity only benefited the larger populous villages, the villages which more than 2000 people. So when we are saying 2000 people, just kind of imagine a large agricultural area, a large inhabitation of the villages. So obviously they have got large area, large cultivation, large production. So obviously we can assume that this particular region belongs to the middle class section of the society. So obviously this middle class section actually benefited much more from the electricity penetration and the internet penetration which took over the years of time. So it says that in this particular large populous villages, there was doubling of the per capita expenditure and there was increase in the income of around 1428 rupees per month. And if we compare that to the small villages, the villages with less than or around 300 people living in there, the monthly per capita expenditure barely changed since 2005. Also, the electricity access to the small remote villages, it states that it has remained a very expensive venture to take by the power discom or the power distribution companies. So this is something which we are going to discuss now, that what are the challenges which are actually associated with the rural electrification. So if you can actually recall the definition which we read, that what actually constitutes an electrified village, you might have guessed that there exists a limitation by definition itself. Because if we are saying that only if 10% of the houses they become electrified in any particular village, the whole village is actually being declared as electrified. That is how we are actually getting to this number of 100% village electrification. Thus, as per the Down to Earth Report 2021, which we are also going to discuss next, it states that 31 million rural households are unconnected to the electricity grid. The second is that the idea which the government embarked upon from the year of 2018, when it stated that okay, we have achieved 100% electrification, now we will envisage 24/7 electricity in these villages, that still remains a distant dream for which the Saubhagya scheme was launched. Because the Down to Earth report actually showcases to us that how in the mega cities of Uttar Pradesh, the average power outage is around 21 minutes in the mega cities. And in the rural areas, there is a normal average outage of 90 minutes a day. Also, when the survey was taken in around 30 villages, it was found that 30% villages were actually unelectrified. Also, there exists a issue of inconsistent supply. So actually in 67% of the villages, they actually complained of unreliable power supply. And even if the power is being supplied, there is issue of low voltage which exists. The second is the faulty charges which are being imposed on these innocent villagers. So for example, around 38% of the electrified villages, they actually reported overcharging from them, right? And the one-time connection charges also differed from villages to villages. Then obviously there exists the issue of lack of accountability, because 52% of these villages actually complain that there exists not any kind of grievance redressal mechanism. If you guys are actually coming from the rural areas, you guys might relate that if there exists any kind of connection in the fault, right, what will actually happen? So if you guys are coming from the rural areas, you guys might relate that if there will take place any fault in the connection and you will go to the nearest by electricity department, your file will actually keep on moving from one table to another and you will actually face the phenomena of red tapeism. Then obviously the another major issue is of data gap, where the report actually states that how 10% of the villages were actually wrongly notified in the government data to be declared as 100% rural electrified. The next is the inaccessibility. So the geographical terrain obviously poses a major problem, and at least in the 30% of these villages. The next major issue which lies is with the supply chain gaps, which is caused because of the issues which are being faced by the distribution companies. So let's say in many of the states, there is actually one big discom or distribution company. So what that actually leads to is that these transformers, they are actually far away from the remote villages or from the hamlets of Dalit. So because if the distance increases, it actually increases the cost of supply. Now, if we compare our discoms in our country, the kind of transmissions and distribution losses which they are facing with the developed countries. So the discoms in the developed countries, they normally faces 9 to 10% TDL losses when they are supplying the electricity to the rural areas. But as per the Niti Aayog report, in our country, these discoms, they are facing TDL losses of 15%. Also, now let's say that as a discom, I have two choices. First is that I supply the power to the urban areas, or I supply the power to the rural areas. When I am supplying power to the urban areas, I am getting 20 rupees per unit. When I am supplying the power to the rural areas, I am only getting 16 rupees per unit, or I am incurring a loss of 4 rupees per unit in the villages. So obviously, why I will choose to supply to the rural area? Because that is actually curbing down my profit. Then this curbing down of profit is further enhanced by the issue of the subsidized rate of electricity supply which this power discoms has to supply to the large number of villages, because the government says that in these villages obviously there exists 56% of the working population which is engaged in agriculture, and this electricity supply is essential for them to irrigate their fields, and thus you have to supply them on subsidized rate. So now let's say that in the months of summer, if there will take place a peak demand, what I will do? Obviously, I will try to cut down the supply in the rural areas because that is not profitable for me. So there will take place a huge power outage in these rural areas. So to deal with all these issues, the government actually came up with Uday scheme in the year of 2015. The idea was that it was a kind of a debt restructuring scheme, the debt which has been incurring by these power discoms because of the huge losses which they were facing. So the government said that 75% of the debt will be shared between state and central government, and 25% of the debt will be paid by the power discoms in the form of bond. Also, in the states in which these power discoms are facing such huge losses, these states will put under the priority funding list under the Gram Jyoti Yojana. However, how this scheme has fared, that we can actually see that the scheme actually envisaged that it will bring down the technical and distribution losses to around 15% from the 22% which existed at that time in the year of 2015. However, for many states, it still remains more than 18%. Just look at the discoms outstanding dues and how it has increased from the year of 2018 to 22, significantly reaching to more than 1 lakh crore in the dues. So the idea is that what we can do now to actually enhance the rural electrification. The first is that we shall create decentralized power grids which runs on the renewable energy. So the idea is that let's say there are 4 villages. The idea is to create a power grid here, and this power grid shall be running on renewable energy to supply the electricity to these villages. The same idea was actually envisaged under your Saubhagya Yojana as well, which wanted to create such solar model hubs or solar model plants in the villages. So what we can do? We can further actually integrate it with the Pradhan Mantri Surya Ghar Yojana, which actually want to incentivize the rooftop solar installation. So we can do that as well. We can start creating microgrids either at homes or nearby the villages itself. Also, the National Electricity Policy 2021, which is in the draft. This draft policy actually envisages that the tariff shall be provided on the cost of supply and not on the cost of units which are being used by the villagers. So the idea is that, okay, if I'm going to provide these tariff, what I can do? So let's say I put a cost of energy saving. I say that if a particular house is only saving or using 10 megawatt of electricity, then that particular person is going to get direct benefit transfer from the government. So instead of subsidizing the electricity through these power discoms, you start giving direct benefit transfers to the villagers who are actually putting impetus on energy saving. And you start putting tariff on the cost of supply, so these ventures in the rural areas actually becomes profitable for these power discoms. The next is that obviously these community owned microgrids which we are envisaging, they will not work unless and until the technological know-how is disseminated to the villagers. And for that purpose, obviously the skilling, the large scale skilling of the villagers, especially under the Kaushal Vikas Yojana 4.0, that is something which we can do. On the basis of this, try to solve this particular question. If possible, comment your answer. We move forward to the next news. During its G20 presidency, India has positioned the digital public infrastructure as technology-enabled instrument for inclusive and sustainable development. This digital public infrastructure forms an important component of your GS2 paper under the theme of government policies and interventions, and in your GS3 paper under the theme of inclusive growth. Let's first try to understand what do we mean by digital public infrastructure. Digital public infrastructure is nothing but a platform which actually registers your identity. So let's say it is using Aadhaar card to do that. And then it enables you to make a digital payment, let's say through the use of UPI app or let's say Paytm, and then it actually allows for the share of information of this payment which has been done using another digital platform, and thus it creates a digital public infrastructure. Now, as per the article today in Indian Express, it actually states that there exist two kinds of DPI, the foundational and the sectoral DPI. What do we mean by foundational DPI? So, foundational DPI is basically the foundational structure of this identity, payment, exchange of information infrastructure. Such as, for example, it has an identity layer which can be accessed through your Aadhaar card or your KYC norms which you do in the bank. Then there exists a payment layer that can be your unified payment interface, Paytm, PhonePe, Google Pay, etc. And then there exists a data empowerment and protection architecture, such as, for example, where you can actually save your important data, that can be your DigiLocker or any account aggregator. Then there exists the second kind of DPI, that is sectoral DPI. What is sectoral DPI? Sectoral DPI is basically which provides specialized services tailored for a specific sector, such as, for example, Ayushman Bharat Digital Mission, which actually caters to what? To provide universal health coverage. Then the major example which has been given in today's article is the success of the CoWIN platform, if you guys can actually recall, which actually registered you through your Aadhaar data, and that actually led to the facilitation of all the information through the digital code. And the person identity was linked to the verified vaccination status, and this CoWIN infrastructure, this DPI, actually enabled India to get around 2.2 billion vaccination and prevented the mass scale destruction which could have taken place. Thus, there exist the various advantages of this digital public infrastructure, such as, for example, as per the data of 2023, there are more than 1.3 billion Aadhaar enrollment which has been done. Also, the finance minister in this budget 2024 stated that because of the huge success of this DPI, the government is actually planning to further filtrate it to various areas, such as, for example, e-commerce, education, law, MSME, etc. The major idea is that because this DPI, it works around a plug and play model. So, for example, me and you, we can also create a payment website, and then through this payment website, we can link it to, let's say, the vaccination program which is taking place. So anyone who goes to any vaccination center can just come out and pay for the vaccine through our app as well. So it is very easy to create such an infrastructure, and that can actually lead to a lot of value creation through this public-private partnership model. Also, thus, the idea is that this digital economy, because of this huge boost by this DPI, it can actually reach to $1 trillion digital economy by the year of 2030 itself. Obviously, this is not an over-assessment, which we can see from this digital snapshot as well, because if we just look at the unified payment interface value-based transactions which took place, that was around $19.64 billion. So obviously the idea is that this DPI is actually going to be very prominent for our country's economic growth and to make it the third largest economy. However, with this DPI, there also exist several rising concerns which has been also raised by the today's article. The first is obviously that when we are talking about this DPI, remember that what happens that it actually works in a free market ecosystem. And in this free market ecosystem, the idea is that the value of a service which is being provided, let's say DPI, that actually increases with the increasing number of participants on the other side. To understand it simply, let's say that I create an app tomorrow. And because you guys sympathize with my poverty, all of you start using this app only for any digital transaction which you are doing. So as the number of participants will increase, the value of this app will increase as well. Over a period of time, what will happen that you will start actually going to your friend and start telling your friend that use this app only for the payment. You don't have this app, what you are doing in life. Because of that, what will take place? I will start creating a kind of a monopoly or oligopoly in the market. So now let's say earlier when you were doing the mobile recharge from my app, I was charging only 50 paise. But now I am charging 1.5 rupees because you guys don't have any other source to do your recharge. That is the idea, because the winner takes all outcome that can actually lead to the anti-competitive market policies, and another such anti-competitive market policy is the zero price market. So when I started my payment app, I did not charge you any cost. It was completely free, and that is called as zero price market. So because of this, all of you started using my app. Over a period of time, I just completely killed my competition, and now I can just put any price which I want for the services which I am providing to you in the name of service charge. That is exactly what has taken place. Just look at the dominant UPI apps in our country, the PhonePe, the Google Pay, the Paytm. Can you guys even recall any fourth name? No. Then obviously, because these apps, they are having all your data. If you're doing the digital transaction, your bank accounts, everything, all that is linked. So this huge amount of information which they are getting, and this information is actually a shareable input. So they have got a huge right over your life choices as well, because they can very easily create an echo chamber around you, and thus it can lead to the breach of data privacy. The data privacy which was held as an intrinsic part of your right to dignified life under Article 21 in the K.S. Putta Swamy judgment of 2017. Also, because of the issues such as, for example, which we were discussing, the digital divide which persists in our country, the 24% of the rural households having internet connection, or for example, the inaccessibility of large scale information or the technical know-how, all that can lead to the lack of access to infrastructure and further create the divide between have and have-nots. Then there obviously exists the language barrier, right? Because most of these services, they are confined majorly to either English, and what if we do not have got like fluency in this particular language? What if someone only speaks Kannada or Tulu? And if they don't have the features available in their language, what they will do? On the basis of this, whatever we have discussed, just try to solve these two very interesting questions. They appear in the prelims examination, one in this year and one in 2020 actually. And then we move forward to the steps which has been taken by the government of India to actually raise the guardrails around the digital public infrastructure. The first is obviously to protect your right to privacy under the Personal Data Protection Act 2023. Also, to prevent the cyber frauds which can take place, the government has launched National Cyber Security Policy 2013. Then the government is actually using the artificial intelligence to provide the services by the government platforms in all the regional languages possible under the Bhashni platform. The government is actually trying to enhance the digital knowledge among the people through Digital Saksharta Abhiyan 2.0. For that, obviously, the internet penetration is more important. So the government has bought Bharat Net project, under which around 6 lakh villages the government is trying to create digital connectivity. The PM Wani scheme for the free Wi-Fi is also very important in this regard. Then there was creation of a G20 task force specifically on this digital public infrastructure, and the article actually suggests that we should create a digital economy task force to plan the DPI's growth for the future of our economy. On the basis of this discussion, Just try to attempt this particular question. Keep on practicing answer writing and we move forward to the next segment. First meeting of the governing body of Anusandhan National Research Foundation has actually approved a program to build partnership between the top research institution and universities to carry out joint research project. This National Research Foundation forms an important component of your GS3 paper under the larger theme of science and technology. The first question which shall come in your mind is, what is the need? What is the need of such National Research Foundation? So just look at the data here which has been sourced from the Department of Science and Technology itself, and it states that how our research and development expenditure as the percentage of GDP has remained stagnant to around 0.7% in the last decade. And if we just look at the top 10 countries with their maximum expenditure or R&D as the percentage of GDP, just look at the staggering number of Israel, 5.3%, just look at USA, 3.4%, just look at India at 0.64%. If we are talking about the total staff in research and development institution, the number of scientific staff in that, just look at the low number of women. If we are talking about the doctorates which were awarded in science and engineering, just look at the low number of doctorates in the emerging field of science and technology, such as for example, veterinary science, agriculture, medicine, etc. Also, if you are talking about the patents filed in the country, just look at the 61,000 patents by India and 15 lakh patents filed by China, almost 100 times greater than us. That is why the idea was that we shall create a National Research Foundation, because the government started observing that if we talk about the total funding, so that is around 0.7% of GDP. Keep this in mind that out of this, 56% actually is sourced from the government, or it is public sector expenditure. The private sector contribution in research and development is only 34%. When we are talking about this 56% public expenditure, so if we talk about the Scientific Education and Research Board which used to exist earlier, so all the funds which were provided to that, it actually used to give more than 80% of the funds only to the Indian Institute of Technologies itself. So obviously the research at the state universities, local level universities, or at the village level, that remain completely excluded from the criteria of the government. That is why government actually brought the National Research Foundation, whose idea was actually envisaged under the National Education Policy of 2020, where it created this NRF as a coordinating agency between the researchers, the various government bodies, such as for example ISRO, and the industry as well. So the major focus here is industry, because if we look at the research grants which will be provided, so that will be provided to individuals and state universities, and the budget which was earmarked, that was around 50,000 crore for 2023 to 2028. Thus, it is a mission mode scheme. Keep this in mind that the idea is that 72% of it will be actually sourced from the private sector itself. For that purpose, it actually subsumed the Scientific Education and Research Board under the NRF as well. Now, let's say that if I'm an individual and I actually submit a research that, see, I want funding for this research, it can actually lead to the cure of cancer in the future. Earlier, what used to take place, that it used to take place 3 to 4 years of time for the approval of such research and grant by the SERB. But now under NRF, the idea is that the peer review will take place only within 6 months. Now, what the news actually offers? The news says that the NRF, first of all, it has lamented that only 1% of the 40,000 higher education institutions, they are actually engaged in any kind of research activities. Only 1%. Thus, ANRF has said that it is launching a program to build the partnership between the top research institutions and universities to carry out a joint research project. And this joint research project will be fully funded by the ANRF. And who is the president of this NRF? That is our Honorable Prime Minister. So we have covered the whole article for you. This is a kind of a new approach which we are following. Moving to the next news now. India is supporting a new disclosure norm for the cross-border credit card transactions under the Financial Action Task Force. Force, which forms an important component of your prelims paper under the theme of important international organizations which you guys should know about. So the question arises that what is Financial Action Task Force? Financial Action Task Force is basically a global money laundering and terrorist financing watchdog, which actually emerged out in the year of 1989 from a meeting of G7 countries which were meeting at Paris. The question for you guys here is that can you guys just name down the G7 countries in the comment box without taking the help of internet? Now, when it actually, in the years of its inception, it actually focused on only money laundering. But after the 9/11 attacks of 2001, which actually shook the nation of USA, it also incorporated the efforts to combat terrorist financing. And from the year of 2012, it has also included under its provision to combat the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. The FATF is actually headed by the FATF plenary, which actually meet 3 times a year. And currently it has got 39 members. Is India a member? Absolutely yes. It has also got 2 regional organizations as its member, and the organizations are European Commission and Gulf Cooperation Council. Now, related to FATF, you guys might be very frequently hearing about 2 kinds of list. What are they? First is the grey list. So the countries which are kept in the grey list, the idea is that they are acting as a safe haven for supporting terror funding and the money laundering. The countries which are kept currently, such as for example Bulgaria, Croatia, Kenya, Mali, etc. Then there are certain countries which are completely declared to be a non-cooperative country, which is for sure supporting money laundering and terror financing, and they are kept in the blacklist, such as for example Iran, Myanmar and Korea. So what these countries will face now? So let's say any of these countries go to World Bank and they ask a loan for it, or IMF, they will not get the loan. Or if there is any debt restructuring plan has to take place in these countries by some clubs, let's say Paris Club, so that cannot take place anymore. Now, how this FATF actually comes or lists these countries in grey or blacklist? So in every country, the government is in the charge of conducting a national risk assessment of these banks, and then it provides information to the assessors, which are basically the mutual evaluation report. These assessors are basically appointed by the FATF itself. Then it assesses with the technical compliance and the effectiveness of the measures which has been taken by the country. So whether it is low, medium or high. And then after enhanced follow-up, it declares it to be either in grey or black list. What our country is actually emphasizing upon now, because of which it has featured in the news, the travel rule guidelines, which India is emphasizing upon, it requires the financial institutions and virtual asset service providers to actually share the data about their cross-border transaction. And once such revised reporting norms are adopted by the FATF, all member countries will have to implement them. With this, we move forward to the next segment of the news, where we are going to actually cover some very interesting news which can help you to excel in the prelims examination as well. Starting from a small quiz which actually appeared in today's Hindu paper on the Paralympics, which has recently concluded. The first question is that which country has topped the medal table again, and that is China with 220 medals and 94 gold. What is the rank which has been secured by India? Can anyone tell me? The second very interesting question is, India has reaped a record haul of 29 medals, so our highest medals in the Paralympics, and the 2 athletes, they actually became 2-time gold winners in this Paralympics. Who are they? So the first is shooter Avni Lekhara and the next is shot putter Sumit Until. India also recorded a 1-2 in athletics for the first time. So for example, we got the gold as well as the silver. That was actually secured in the men's club throw. Then after clinching a gold medal at Rio, a silver at the Tokyo, which Indian became the first Indian to actually win at like continuous 3 consecutive Paralympics? That is M. Thangavelu in high jump. And at just the age of 17 years, who has made history as India's youngest Paralympic medalist? That is armless archer Sheetal Devi. So keep this in mind, they can actually feature in that 1-line questions as well. Now, the black sand has actually featured in the news. So there are two types of black sand. The first is the kind of a magnetic mixture of the fine sand containing minerals which are found as the placer deposits, and they are actually found on the beaches near the volcano consisting of basalt, right? So there are two kinds, one which we are getting near the beaches, the second is at the placer deposit. And what does these black sand actually contain? So keep this in mind, they are very rich source for rare earth elements, thorium, tungsten, titanium, as well as important jewels like ruby and diamond. So maybe you guys might be looking for these things next time when you guys are going to any beach. The third is about a dangerous Montelukast. What is Montelukast? Montelukast is basically a drug which is considered to be responsible to control the asthma. Why patients actually take this drug, which has actually been declared by various health authorities to be quite harmful to the humans? Because the patients, they actually prefer these short-term medications over the long-term inhalers. So the US FDA, the Food and Drug Authority there, that has actually kept it in black box warning. Obviously, India might have also taken such very stringent step. No, as per the editorial today, India, this particular Montelukast is completely unregulated, largely irrational, and actually its use seems to be increasing exponentially. Coming to the last news of the day, that is Polaris Dawn mission, which is actually going to be launched on the SpaceX Dragon capsule, which is basically a 5-day mission that could reach the highest crowded Earth orbit ever flown. What is the height? The height is around 1400 km from the Earth, so it will go till there and into the inner band of Van Allen radiation belt. So all of you who have been watching Analyst continuously, we have covered this Van Allen radiation belt, which is actually associated with the magnetic fields around the Earth, right? Now, why this Polaris Dawn mission is actually being talked about so much? Because it will actually attempt the spacewalk. This will be the first private spacewalk, right? Not actually sponsored by the countries. So what is a spacewalk? Spacewalk is basically the extravehicular activity which take place outside the spacecraft by the astronaut. And when was the first ever spacewalks taken by whom? By Alexei Leonov, who was basically the astronaut of USSR when the space race was taking place between USA and USSR, also in the backdrop of the Cold War which existed. So with this, we have reached to the end of our discussion today. Do not forget to attempt the questions at the end of the video and test your knowledge. We will meet in a very interesting discussion very soon. Till then, all the very best for your preparation and thank you.